Insurrectionary Ecology, Chapter 2, A Sense of Perspective. This chapter begins with a quote. Moments of time no longer radiate as they did in the cyclical time of early societies. Time is a thread stretched from birth to death, from memories of the past to expectations of the future, on which an eternity of survival strings out. A row of instants and hybrid presents nibbled away by what passed and what is yet to come. The feeling of living in symbiosis with cosmic forces, the sense of the simultaneous. Revealed joys to our forefathers which our passing presence in the world is hard put to provide. That's from the Revolution of Everyday Life. When we see history as a series of events, or even worse, perceive ourselves in an isolated bubble of moving time, disconnected from the past, we are disempowered. Our actions, any actions, seem like pissing in the ocean in the face of our opposition. But our actions are not isolated events. They are explosions in a web of relations, many unforeseen. The project of liberation has been vying with domination for thousands of years and continues. The ripples cast by our actions shape ourselves, our relations, and inspire others now and in the future. Knowing the history of our movements and others' attempts give us context beyond ephemeral slogans. History is cumulative. This is another quote. In a sense, there is no beginning and there is no end. It's all process, an open-ended question. It has been pointed out that people respond to events rather than processes, particularly in spectacular society, where social phenomena are pried loose from their social context and reproduced as disembodied and mystifying events. Conversely, ecology is, if nothing else, the story of context, the antithesis of spectacular amnesia. That's from Do or Die, Issue 8. This is a struggle we will never win. There will be no tangible victory, but every action you take has the possibility of adding to a better future. If you understand that, then all of your actions have meaning and importance. In the case of ecological defense, they can also save places and the species that live there now. The following books give an impression of the context of the struggles for freedom and the legacy of domination. Read them and make up your own mind. Down with Empire, Up with the Spring, Part 1, Recent Prehistory, in Do or Die, Issue 10. Against Leviathan, Against History, by Freddie Pellman. The Ecology of Freedom, by Murray Bookchin. Guns, Germs and Steel, A Short History of Everybody for the Last 13,000 Years, by Jared Diamond. That was a short chapter, so I'm going to read the next one as well. Chapter 3, Evolving a Counterculture. We need a culture that is ecological, that is politically and socially thoughtful. We need a culture that will sustain us in our struggles and meet our needs as individuals. We need a culture that celebrates life and joy and beauty, where people and other species are not sacrificed to things. The green movement has often been seen as ascetic, constantly asking people to give up the good things in life, and is often seen, when appeals have failed, to favour repression in terms of encouraging government to legislate against people's behaviour. Freud taught us there are two ways in which society can deal with moral vice. It can try to repress the act by some combination of intimidation and punishment. As every naughty child knows, this works, but only for as long as watchful authority is on hand to enforce its dictates. If it once looks aside, the vice re-emerges, possibly to be perpetrated with greater relishes and forbidden pleasure. The better course, he advised, is to find ways to divert unacceptable conduct into acceptable forms of gratification. He called this sublimation, which might mean salvaging some residue of nobility that lies hidden in otherwise base conduct. By and large, the strategy of the environmental movement in dealing with wasteful consumption has been repression. Committed ecologists have often been sternly censorious, meeting off human frailties with doctrinaire intelligence. There is a strain of stern asceticism running through environmental politics that has been unwilling to recognize, let alone condone, the connection between consumerism and the search for personal fulfillment. That's from Voice of the Earth by Theodore Roszak. The author says that most of this book is of limited interest. Shame and guilt have been used by authoritarian religious and political movements of thousands of years. The conclusion that many radical ecologists have come to is that the roots of our ecological and social problems are buried in manipulation and domination by hierarchies and elites with vested interests. I don't want to be constricted by a green government, or for continuing environmental catastrophe to edge us towards eco-fascism. You have to acknowledge people's impressions, and people's impressions of the ecological movement often see it in this light, as repressive. If people are not to revolt against ecologically better ways of doing things, they must decide to make changes themselves. The other side of the coin that we are faced with is that the world just cannot sustain equality and freedom that embraces current levels of consumerism. It has to develop an ecological sensibility. The passion to own, indeed to waste, is more than mindless extravagance. Consumer egalitarianism is clearly the inevitable adjunct of pointed out that people... That sentence doesn't make sense. That people respond to events rather than processes, particularly in spectacular society, where social phenomena are prized loose from their social context and reproduced as disembodied and mystifying events. Conversely, ecology is, if nothing else, the story of context, the antithesis political equality of necessity. A democratic social order must be an ecological order, and the truer the democracy, meaning the more authentically accessible the power and the goods, the more real must be the collective ecological intelligence of the society must be. The standards of consumption set by aristocrats and the early industrial bourgeoisie simply cannot be extended to society en masse. Rather, the desires that undergird those standards, the craving for specialness, distinction, personal worth, must be uncovered, examined, reshaped. The aspiration must be peeled down to its essence. In practical environmental terms, what does it mean, in the words of the old popular slogan, to proclaim every man a king? This is also from Voice of the Earth by Theodore Roszak. People have a desire to live unrestrained. They want fulfillment, and also security and safety. Desire has been manipulated and manufactured by advertising and the media. Fulfillment has been left hollow by consumerism. False participation in the spectacle of society replacing real relationships. As this becomes more extreme, people begin to wonder about spending the majority of their life working to spend their evenings sitting in isolation in front of their widescreen TV, being told what expensive products they must buy to be a legitimate member of society, and watching other people's lives. There is a wonderful wild world out there that I would be part of, that I am part of. It is under sustained assault by the way many of us choose to live our lives, and the perceived choices offered to us by the systems we live under. Our cultures need to be biocentric, as we are part of the biosphere. We need to constantly think about our relations to each other species in the environment, and act responsibly. We need to respect people's genuine needs and individuality. If protecting our ecology is not to involve using shame, guilt, and general oppression to prevent people acting irresponsibly, it needs to be a project of full participation, voluntary cooperation, and mutual aid. It also has to have the genuine needs of individuals at its heart. This is a quote. Nothing gives me the right to speak in the name of other people. I am my own delegate. Yet at the same time I can't help thinking that my life is not of concern to me alone, but that I serve the interest of thousands of other people by living the way I live, and by struggling to live more intensely and more freely. My friends and I are one, and we know it. Each of us is acting for each other by acting for himself. Such transparency is the only way to true participation. And that's from the Revolution of Everyday Life. If we don't want to heckle people from a position removed, we must attract people based on their own self-interest to join a cultural project that meets both their needs and fulfills their desires. That is both rich and diverse, To tell the truth, the only reason anyone fights is for what they love. Fighting for everyone else is only the consequence. People are tired of surviving. Survival is simply to die very slowly. People want to live. Life is sold to us as the acquisition of things. This quest for a standard of living defined by what you can be convinced to buy is destroying life on our planet. The risk is that people will suffer greater oppression by authority that is forced into desperate action to avert the economic impacts of ecological disaster. If consumption by people within the captive cycles of consumer culture, or the increased consumption of people in the opening markets of global capitalism, is not to destroy our ecology to the point it cannot sustain us, or other species irrespective of our needs, then they must be attracted to join in a cultural project that offers visible alternatives. People must be able to satisfy desires for personal fulfillment in ways that don't risk our future, or the future of the planet's other species. This can only happen by us starting now, by creating and discovering those alternatives, and recognizing those compatible values embedded in traditional cultures. The utopianists Lewis Mumford and Ernest Callenbach offered the following ideas. Plenitude, a sense of enoughness that can only be achieved when people are encouraged to ask, well, for what? And the suggestion, people take joy in one another's company, in the beauty of the land, in simple sensuous pleasure that costs no resources. The project is to build a social culture that ranges from voluntary simplicity to a radical hedonism. Do as you will, but let it harm none, including the lives of other species. That is based on a natural wildness, a joie de vivre. The only safeguard against authority and rigidity setting in is a playful attitude. It must include connecting people and re-enchanting people with the natural world. How can you care for something you don't have a real relationship with? Real nature must be integral to our everyday lives, not a mythological anthropomorphic supernature tailored to human needs, or a theme park romantic nature to visit. But a chaotic nature that is independent of our concerns. Passion and love should lead us to play and fight along those who show the same desires, to build relationships to break out of the isolation of modern society. It is also important that our cultures recognize what people value and hold dear, that are not destructive or oppressive, and the underlying motivations behind destructive and oppressive actions and values. We should value aspects of our different cultures that allow us to build bridges between our different cultural understandings, and accept the diversity of living alongside different cultures. The ecological movement has often been motivated by the need to conserve and protect. Many of the values we are looking to encourage can already be found in people's cultures. These values should be encouraged and strengthened by practical application. This can often be easier and more reassuring for people than constant calls for change. This is another quote. We were becoming uneasy about the recurring theme that people must change. We began to wonder if the reasons why parties advocating radical change were so unsuccessful was because they were striking against the resistance of people who had changed, who had been compelled to change too much. The experience of industrialization had been driven in relentless change, and continues to be so even in countries which pride themselves on having reached an advanced stage of development, of being post-industrial, of being developed. Constantly require accelerating change from their privileged populations. So why should we expect that exhortations to change will be welcomed by those who have known little else for at least 2 centuries? In this context, the desire to conserve, to protect, to safeguard, to rescue, to resist becomes the heart of the radical project. Safety and stability are important to the majority of people. This need is magnified in times of crisis. People will run away, fall back on the illusion of stability of authoritarian relationships, or rely on cooperation and mutual aid based on affinity and trust. If we are trying to evolve and protect an alternative society, this will matter even more for us. Relatively peaceful social struggle and construction is only possible up to a point, the point at which it becomes begins to seriously undermine elite power. Without going back to the history of the Spanish anarchist or other libertarian revolutions, look what happened to recent alternative social experiments. New travellers, urban squat communities, free parties and festivals. Oppression called many people to give up and conform. A lot of people, including some of the most creative, left for other countries, and the things that we held dear were sanitized, hollowed out, and pale imitations sold back to us as acceptable rebellion. A corporate world where everything is exchanged, nothing is taken, nothing is given. Social centres, squatted or legal, autonomous zones, housing co-ops, free parties and gigs, land co-ops, shared allotments, trespass, wild camping, acquiring things for free, giving things away for free. Develop thoughtful alternatives to play with. Create cross-generational spaces where people can build relationships that will nurture and support people's changes in their own time. Our responsible to any revolutionary process is not to make a revolution, but to evolve countercultures that can make revolutionaries. Although the cultures we create may in some ways be significantly different to mainstream culture, it cannot be escapist or it will be isolated, demonized and destroyed. It must be based in the places people live and reach out to those communities, rather than appearing to be a private cult for freaks. It must offer real moments and relationships that fulfill people. This is especially true as many of us will be using these embryonic communities as places from which to resist an attack, and this resistance must be sustained. Sun Tzu counseled that even under attack an enemy will only fall through its own mistakes and weaknesses. The key to victory is not so much to defeat one's enemy, instead it is to make oneself undefeatable. If our resistance is to be sustainable, it must have a place for everyone to be supported by participating. The repercussions of direct action get larger the older people get. The old adage that the workers have nothing to lose but their chains could be replaced by the workers in the West have nothing to lose but their mortgages, jobs, custody of their children, pensions, and partners. How surprising, then, that a movement whose whole strategy is based on risk, danger, transcend, and illegality attracts only those too young to have obtained anything to lose. If our resistance is to be sustained, it must be a project of inclusion and security, as well as attack and defense. If developing an ecological sensibility is to be evolutionary without coercion, then the need for self-defense is obvious to allow space for this to happen. This is a quote. The difference between a criminal and an outlaw is that while criminals frequently are victims, outlaws never are. Indeed, the first step towards becoming a true outlaw is the refusal to be victimized. All people who live subject to other people's laws are victims. People who break laws out of greed, frustration, or vengeance are victims. People who overturn laws in order to replace them with their own laws are victims. We outlaws, however, don't merely live beyond the letter of the law. Many businessmen, most politicians, and all cops do that. We live beyond the spirit of the law. In a sense, then, we live beyond society. Here we have a common goal. That goal is to turn the tables on the nature of society. When we succeed, we raise the exhilaration content of the universe. We even raise it a little bit when we fail. That is from Still Life with Woodpecker by Tom Robbins, taken from Cultures of Resistance. And that's the end of the chapter.